We're shining the spotlight on one of the world's best, Ding Liren, with 3 thrilling games in his famous French defense. We start things off with a game against Zhang Pengxiang, who starts with e4. Ding Liren replies with e6, the French defense. The French defense has a reputation for solidity and resilience. White often gets a space advantage on the king side, whereas black will counterattack on the queen side. Now, given the opportunity to get full control over the center, white follows with d4, and black immediately strikes back with d5. This attacks the pawn, so white defends it with knight to c3, and black continues to attack it with knight to f6. White pins that knight to the queen, and here e5 could be pretty annoying, so black takes the pawn. White recaptures with his knight, adding an attacker to black's pinned knight, so black defends it with knight b to d7. Then white carries on development, and here black asks the question to the bishop with h6. Now that bishop certainly cannot move because the other knight is hanging. So white takes the knight with check, and after black recaptures, now white drops his bishop back to e3. Ding Liren continues to chase that bishop with knight to d5, and maybe white should drop his bishop back another square, trying to preserve his bishop pair, but he instead prioritizes development with bishop to d3. This allows black to take the bishop, and after white recaptures, his king is slightly weakened with the removal of the f-pawn. White follows with bishop to d6, looking to castle kingside, and white pushes his pawn in the center, getting a powerful central pawn duo. Black immediately strikes with c5, attacking the pawn, and now c3 is possible, trying to preserve his central pawn duo, but white plays e5, gaining some space with tempo. The black bishop drops to e7, and white jumps his queen to e2, hinting at a possibility of castling queenside. Now black could take this pawn, because it is hanging, but were he to take that pawn, white would in fact castle queenside, and things would get dangerous with the rook lined up with black's queen. The immediate threat being bishop to b5 check, opening a discovered attack on the pawn to win it back. So black avoids this line, instead developing his queen to a5 with check, which gets off the potentially open d file while defending his pawn. White blocks the check with c3, and black moves his bishop to d7, blocking the potential check. White castles kingside here, and black drops his queen to b6, peering at the enemy king, who immediately sidesteps to h1. Then black gains some queenside space with a5, and here white drops his knight back to d2, with the idea that even after black temporarily wins the pawn on d4, white can jump his knight to c4, trying to deflect the black queen away from the pawn's defense. Now black can keep his queen defending the pawn, with queen to a7 for example, but this puts the queen on a very passive square, and white gets really good attacking opportunities after queen to h5, adding an attacker to the f7 pawn. Black doesn't want to go through all this potential danger here, so he instead does not move his queen to a7. But there's also queen to c5. But here white has queen to f3, double attacking the f7 and b7 pawns, so white's going to win the pawn back. So black drops his queen to c7, keeping it in the game, but allowing white to recapture the pawn on d4. Black moves his bishop to c6, peering again at the enemy king, and white continues with queen to g4, attacking the g7 pawn. Black defends it by castling, and you see the evaluation bar jumping up here, and that's because white has an insane move that I assume both the players did not see, and that is rook to f6. This move is so strong because white has a crazy attack here. And there are a lot of variations here, but let's just go over it quickly. The idea is that black can't take the rook because white gets a really strong attack here, threatening checkmate. And then white would jump his other knight, threatening to sacrifice here, and black would have to defend it. And the line goes on and on. This attacks the h6 pawn. White will continue with h5 to pile up on that pinned pawn. And we don't have to go any further, but you get the idea. That would be really dangerous for black. But luckily for him, white doesn't see that move, which many people wouldn't see, instead centralizing his other rook to e1. Black continues with b5, hitting the knight, who drops to d2, and then black centralizes his other knight on d8. White follows with knight e4, looking at some weak squares in black's camp, and here Ding takes the pawn on d4, because the knight was interfering with the white queen's defense. Then white follows with knight f6, check, opening a discovered attack on the rook. Black takes the knight, and white takes the rook here, going up some material. White follows with rook to d1, hitting the queen, who moves back to g4, and then black takes the pawn on e5, creating a battery aimed at the h2 pawn. Now, what's happened here is black got a bishop and 2 pawns for the rook, which means material is even, but black is doing slightly better thanks to his powerful bishop pair in an open position, and the fact that he's about to win another pawn at the very least. White plays this crazy move, bishop to g6, and the reason this works is because black can't take the bishop without hanging the e6 pawn, which white would take with a fork on the bishop, winning it back. So black doesn't take it, instead playing rook to d4, hitting the queen, who moves to h3. Black follows with bishop to f6, getting his bishop out of the line of fire, and white moves his other rook to c1, hitting this bishop, so that black still can't take the bishop onto g6, because white would take the pawn on e3 with a check, forking the bishop, and again, white would win back the piece. So black still doesn't take that bishop, instead moving his queen to d6, out of the pin, and creating a battery onto white's back rank. So white's bishop drops all the way back to b1, and here black plays rook to h4, hitting the queen, while having this lingering idea of queen to h2 checkmate. And white is in some serious trouble here. White has to take the bishop on c6 to deflect the queen away from the attack on h2, which black takes the rook, and now the white queen is safe to move, and she goes to d3, creating some threats on h7. But there really isn't a threat, because were the queen to go to h7, the black king can safely run away. So black slides his rook over to g4, creating a new checkmate threat onto g2. White defends it with rook to g1, and black plays g6, blocking the diagonal. White follows with h3, hitting the rook, who slides over to d4, counterattacking the queen, who sidesteps to e3. Black jumps his queen to d5, creating a battery onto the back rank, and white plays bishop to c2, defending that square. Black moves his rook to d2, hitting the bishop, and white moves it again, counterattacking the black queen. Black slides the queen over, now offering a queen exchange, because if we count the pieces, black won back the exchange, so he's simply up 2 pawns, and would love a queen exchange. But white wants none of that, jumping his queen to a7, hitting some of black's frail queenside pawns. Black jumps his queen to f4, hitting the bishop, and white takes the pawn on a5, threatening, saying, if you take my bishop, I'll take back your rook and I'll be up some material. And white just won a pawn. But this was a little bit greedy by white, because here, black has a checkmate in 6. Can you find the winning plan? The white queen is way on the other side of the board, which means she's nowhere near to defend her poor husband. The move black plays to win the game is bishop to e5, threatening a checkmate that really just can't be stopped. White follows with queen to a8, giving check, but the black king simply dodges. Then white plays g3, stopping that checkmate, and that's the only way to do it. But then black jumps his queen to f2, and that's all she wrote. There's no way white can safely defend the checkmate on h2. The only thing white can do is delay it with a move like queen to f2. Black's going to take that, and then bishop to g2 blocks that, but here that undefends the pawn on g3, which black will take, and queen h2 will come next with checkmate. The next opponent is Liu Shanglei, and he meets the French defense with knight to d2. This avoids getting in front of the c-pawn, which white can still move to defend his center, and potentially break any pins on his knight. Black follows with bishop to e7, delaying the development of his knight, because knight to f6 would probably be met with e5. White follows with bishop to d3, and black strikes in the center with c5. White takes the pawn, and only now black develops his knight to f6, since e5 has less support and would probably be a weakness in the future. White follows with queen to e2. The reason he plays queen to e2 is because here black has the idea of taking on e4, and after all of the exchanges, if we were to visualize this, black would eventually take the queen on d1, leading to white being unable to castle. So white does move his queen off that file, and black castles his king. White could try b4 here, holding onto the pawn, but black would get quick development with knight to c6, while white's king would still be in the center. So instead of this, white plays knight g to f3, letting his pawn go, but black still doesn't take it, instead playing e5, getting some queenside space. White castles his king, and here bishop takes c5 could be met with knight to b3, which would be annoying, so instead black develops his other knight to a6, looking to recapture the pawn another way. White follows with e5, hitting the knight, who drops back to d7, and then white plays c3, giving his bishop a retreat square, since a knight is coming to c5 to attack it, and that happens on the very next move. That bishop drops to c2, and black plays b6, supporting his knight. White plays rook to e1, and black plays f6, striking in the center. White follows with b4, hitting the knight, and after some pawn exchanges, black drops his knight to a6, adding an attacker to the b4 pawn. White takes on f6 next. Black recaptures with his knight, and here white moves his attacked pawn with b5, hitting the knight, who can now safely return back to c5. Then white puts his bishop on the long diagonal, and black shifts his queen over to e8, able to see the queen side, and pressuring the b5 pawn. White jumps his knight to e5, looking at some juicy squares in black's camp, and black defends that square with bishop to b7 next. White follows with f3, blunting this long diagonal, and black plays bishop to d6, hitting the knight. White drops his knight back to d3, and now black takes the pawn, since that knight interferes with the queen's defense. But white has ideas to win the pawn back with bishop to d4, trying to remove the defense of black's weak e6 pawn. So white does have some compensation for the lost pawn. Black drops his queen to c6, getting off the potentially dangerous semi-open b file. And then white takes the knight, removing the defender of the e6 pawn. Black recaptures with his bishop, with the idea of taking the bishop with check, so that white does not have time to take the pawn on e6. White defends his bishop with knight to b3, and black moves his rook over to e8, defending his pawn. White follows with rook a to c1, peering at the enemy black queen, who sidesteps over to d6. Then white shifts his king over to h1, off the bishop's diagonal. Black follows with bishop to a6, hitting the white queen, who jumps up to e3. And now here, white has some ideas of first taking the bishop so that his bishop is not pinned to his queen, and then taking the black knight to open up black's king side. So black moves his knight over to d7, which also defends his bishop, who's under heavy fire by white's pieces. White follows with f4, stopping black from playing e5, and now that e6 pawn becomes more of a permanent weakness. White follows with bishop to c4, clogging up this diagonal, and white plays queen to h3, creating a threat on the h7 pawn. White plays h6, stopping that, and white slides his queen over to g4, putting some new threats onto the g7 pawn, with checkmate. Black takes that bishop, stopping that checkmate threat, and white recaptures with the knight. And then black jumps his knight back to f6, hitting the queen, who moves over to h3. This does hang the f4 pawn, which black takes, but that leaves the defense of the e6 pawn, which white takes in return. Black follows with queen to g4, hitting the queen, and adding an attacker to the knight, which forces a queen exchange, and this is good for black because black is up a pawn. Black recaptures the queen, and white jumps his bishop to g6, hitting the rook. Black dodges his rook to e7, then white drops his knight back to d4, opening an attack on black's rook. And black doesn't really want to take white's rook here, because then white would get full control over this open e file. So instead of that, black drops his knight to e5, blocking the file, while attacking the bishop, whose capture would defend the rook, which would be under attack. So instead of that, white drops his bishop back to b1, defending his pawn. And I guess I overlooked this during my previous analysis, but if bishop takes a2, white would be able to play knight f5, hitting the rook, and black would have to drop it since it still needs to defend the knight. And here white would have rook to c7, getting a very active position. So black avoids that, not taking the pawn, instead moving his rook over to f8, guarding this f5 square. And white could still play f5, knight to f5 here. That would be the best move. But instead plays g3, creating a path for his king to run to the center. Now black should play rook to f2 here, getting an active rook, but instead drops his other rook to e8, I suppose getting off this attack. White starts activating his king, and black plays knight to g4, hoping to exchange some pieces since he is still up a pawn. But white doesn't exchange pieces, instead playing bishop to g6, trying to force black to initiate the exchange so he could get full control over that open e-file. Black instead plays knight to e3 check, and the king dodges to g1, before black jumps his rook to e5, getting out of the attack. And importantly, that rook goes to e5 because after black's knight gets under fire, black can drop the knight to g4, which defends the rook. White takes the rook and black recaptures with the knight, and then black has to move his bishop who's under attack, and it goes to f5. Black follows with king to f7, starting to get his king into the game, and white plays rook to a3, looking for that open a file. Black follows with king to f6, putting some pressure on that bishop, but the bishop's defended, so it's not a big deal, and white starts activating his king. Black follows with g6, hitting the bishop, who drops all the way back, and then black starts moving his king towards the queen side. White plays rook to a7 check, and black moves his king up to d6, and then white plays a4. And here black's already up a pawn, but white was overlooking something that black is threatening. Can you find how black can win in a couple of moves? Now going back a move, white has to realize that his king is in a little bit of a sticky situation. A move like bishop to d1, trying to come back to defend his king, would be a little bit better. But a4 does nothing to defend against black's threat, and the move Ding plays to win the game is bishop to f1 check. Now the king only has two legal moves, but they both lead to the exact same outcome. The move in the game is king to g1, and black plays bishop to h3, and here white resigns. The threat is rook to f1, checkmate, and white can't do anything to stop it. The only thing he can do is delay the game with a move like, let's say it starts with knight b5 check, the king would move, and then white would have to play another check, and the king would move, and then white would have to play bishop to f5, blocking the file, and black would take that, threatening a checkmate, but with these checks, white is able to drop his rook back to defend, but that doesn't change the fact that black just won a full piece, along with his pawn, which would be a decisive amount of material. The final opponent is Gao Rui, and he meets the French defense with knight c3 defending his pawn. Ding jumps his knight to f6, continuing to attack it, but then white plays e5, kicking the knight back to d7. White follows with f4, which is an aggressive approach in response to the French defense that gains space on the king's side. Black plays c5, striking back in the center, and white develops his knight to f3, defending the pawn. Black continues to pressure with knight to c6, and white plays bishop to e3, continuing to defend it. Then black plays a6 in preparation of b5, gaining space on the queen side. White develops his queen to d2, and black plays b5, preparing to play b4, kicking the knight, so white stops that with a3. Black shifts his rook over to b8, and white takes the pawn on c5, and black recaptures it with his bishop. Then white takes the bishop, and black recaptures with the knight. Now this bishop exchange is actually pretty good for white, because if we look at the pawn structure, all of black's pawns are on light squares, whereas white's pawns are on dark squares, so getting rid of the dark squared bishop is good for white. White follows with b4, kicking the knight, back to d7, and then developing his bishop to d3, preparing to castle kingside. But black doesn't allow that. Ding plays queen to b6, cutting off the kingside castle. White shifts his queen over to f2, offering an exchange of queens, but black inserts f6, trying to break down white's advanced pawn. White takes the pawn, and first black takes the queen on f2, and after white recaptures with his king, black takes back the pawn, trying to create a strong pawn center. But white has this move f5, and now black has... It's very difficult for black to not get a ruined pawn structure. He can't push e5 here because that would hang the d5 pawn. And black's about to get these 3 pawn islands. But the move f5 also gives up control of the e5 square, so black is able to jump his knight forward. White shifts his rook over from hd1, peering at the enemy king, so black gets his king out of the center. Then white takes the pawn on e6, and look at that. Black's pawn structure is not great, but he does have some good piece activity. Black recaptures with his bishop, and white moves his knight over to e2 with a long-term plan of maneuvering a knight to the weak c5 square. Black drops his bishop to f7, and white jumps his knight from e to d4, and black takes it, exchanging one pair of knights, but that other knight is still going to end up on c5 at some point. Black moves his rook over to the semi-open c-file, and white carries on with his plan. Black jumps his rook to c3, and the threat is here. Let's say, for example, white plays h3. Black would take the bishop on d3, forcing the pawn to recapture, and then that pawn would leave this knight hanging, and black would win a piece. But white always wanted to play knight c5, and he does exactly that. Black moves his bishop over to g6, trying to weaken the c2 pawn. White takes the bishop, and black recaptures with the pawn, slightly improving his pawn structure, and then white plays rook to e2, defending his pawn. Black follows with knight g4 check, and the king is kicked back to g1, and then black plays knight to e3, adding an attacker to this pawn. Now white here could take on a6, but that opens the a file for the black rook, and this a pawn could become slightly weak. So white avoids doing that for now, instead defending his pawn with rook to a2. Black moves his rook over to c8, trying to double up eventually if this knight were ever to move. And white plays a5, trying to open up the a file for his rook. Black follows with d4, starting to push his pawn, because if this c pawn ever disappears, then this would be a passed d pawn, and pushing it forward would be good for black. White proceeds to attack that pawn, and then black takes on a4, and white recaptures with his knight, hitting the rook, who takes on c2, which is exactly what black wanted, and now he has a passed d pawn. White moves his knight back to c5, interfering with the doubled up rooks, so now this rook is hanging, and so it goes to c1, giving check. The king moves over to f2, and black plays a5, getting his knight because his pawn was already hanging a bunch of times, and he's hoping that white would take back with the pawn, which would hang the knight. But white doesn't do that, instead dropping his knight to b3, hitting both the rook and the pawn. The rook jumps up to c3, cutting off the king's path forward, and even though white gets the pawn on a5, black plays knight to g4 check, kicking the king back to a passive position. White follows with d3, and that pawn's getting awfully close to promotion. White plays, and also, let's not forget here, d3 also cuts off the e3 square, so now there's a threat of, let's say white plays h3, there's a threat of rook to c1, which would lead to checkmate, with these squares being covered. Let's go back. So white plays g3 here, giving his king that escape route. White follows with rook to c1 check, and the king jumps forward, and then white plays rook to c2, rook 8 to c2, trying to force his pawn forward. He wants it to get as far forward as possible. White drops his knight to b3, hitting the rook, who moves over, counterattacking the knight. The knight jumps back to c5, and the threat here is to take the pawn, which is what white is trying to do. If we go back a move, his best move is knight to d4, hitting the rook. But this would give up a pawn. Eventually, black would exchange rooks, and then black would take this pawn. So white doesn't want to do that, instead playing knight to c5, threatening this pawn. But there's a tactic here, and black can win the game. Can you find how black wins here? Now the knight has moved, and that means the rook on d2 has slightly less defense. The move Ding plays to take advantage of that is the brilliant rook to d1. This takes advantage of the pin on the rook to the king, which means white, of course, can't take that rook. And these rooks are in a little bit of a suspicious situation. Now let's look at what happens here. If the rook on A takes black's rook, black would recapture with the pawn, and here white's rook is still hanging, and black's pawn is about to promote, so white would have to take it, but then here comes knight to e3 with a fork. And seeing this construction is really, really important for the tactic. So that means the A rook can't take, so in the game, white takes with the other rook. Black recaptures with the pawn, and still that pawn is one square away from promotion, and of course white can't take it because of the fork. So white needs to find another way to stop the pawn from promoting, but it's really difficult to do that. He tries knight to b3, so that at least if black were to promote, maybe this position is savable, but probably not. It's already winning. And black isn't satisfied with just a piece up, which most people would be. Instead, he attacks the knight, trying to get a full queen. The king attacks black's knight, and black just moves it to e3, defending his pawn. White plays rook a7, a8 check, in a desperate attempt to create something, but there really isn't anything, because after black plays king to h7, white resigns the game. This pawn's about to promote, there's nothing much you can do. Rook to c8, and black would just take this knight, and he already is up a bunch of material, but he's going to be up some more. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Use my link in the description to buy a chess.com membership, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.